The rain had been falling over the city since early morning, painting the streets with reflections that looked like broken mirrors. People rushed beneath umbrellas, expensive cars rolled through wet roads, and giant screens on buildings flashed advertisements for luxury brands that most people would only dream of touching. In the center of the financial district stood the most prestigious shopping avenue in the city, a place where marble sidewalks met glittering storefronts and where a single watch could cost more than a house. Men in tailored suits walked with confidence while women carrying designer bags moved from one boutique to another. Everyone there seemed to belong to the same world, a world of money, status, and appearances. Everyone except one boy. He looked no older than 10. His shoes were worn at the edges, his jacket was too large for his small body, and tiny drops of rain clung to his dark hair. Yet his eyes held something unusual. They carried curiosity instead of shame. While others stared at luxury products with desire, he stared with fascination, as if each object told a story. His name was Mateo. In his right hand he carried a small paper envelope that he held tightly against his chest as if it contained treasure. Mateo stopped in front of a famous watch boutique. The display lights illuminated rows of magnificent watches behind crystal glass. Gold, silver, leather, diamonds, each piece sat on its stand like a work of art. Mateo moved closer until his nose almost touched the glass. His eyes widened. He wasn't looking at the most expensive one. He wasn't staring at the one covered in diamonds. He was staring at a simple watch with a dark leather strap and a clean white face. To anyone else, it looked ordinary compared to the others. To Mateo, it looked perfect. Behind him, a deep voice suddenly spoke. "You like that one?" Mateo turned and saw an elderly security guard standing by the entrance. The man smiled gently. Mateo nodded. "It's beautiful." The guard looked at the watch and then back at the boy. "It is beautiful. But these aren't exactly cheap." Mateo looked down at the paper envelope in his hand. "I know." The guard expected him to walk away, like many children did after realizing reality stood between dreams and possibility. But Mateo didn't move. Instead, he asked quietly, "Can I go inside?" The guard hesitated. The boutique was known for serving wealthy clients only. The employees treated appearances almost as seriously as money itself. Still, the old man looked at the boy's face and saw sincerity there. He opened the door. Mateo stepped inside. Immediately warmth surrounded him. Soft music played in the background. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished wood. 3 employees looked toward the entrance. Their smiles faded almost instantly. One woman whispered something to another employee. Mateo pretended not to notice. He walked carefully toward the watch he had seen outside. A young salesperson approached him with a practiced smile that seemed more forced than friendly. "Can I help you?" Mateo pointed. "I want to see that watch." The woman blinked. "That one?" "Yes." She looked him up and down. Then she looked at the envelope in his hand. Then back at him. Her expression changed. "Sweetheart, these are very expensive items." Mateo nodded again. "I know." "And, are your parents here?" Mateo shook his head. The woman crossed her arms. "I'm sorry, but perhaps you should come back with an adult." Mateo stared at the watch. "I just want to see it." Before she could answer, another voice interrupted. A confident laugh echoed through the boutique. Everyone turned. A tall man wearing a perfectly tailored black suit had entered through the main doors. 2 assistants followed behind him carrying bags and documents. The employees instantly straightened themselves. Mr. Alejandro Vargas. Their faces transformed into excitement. Alejandro Vargas was one of the city's most famous businessmen. Rich beyond imagination, owner of companies across several countries, known for his success and his arrogance. He walked with the confidence of a man who believed the world belonged to him. As he passed by Mateo, he noticed the small boy standing near the display. Then he smirked. "What do we have here?" No one spoke. Alejandro approached slowly. Mateo looked up. "What are you doing here, Keith?" "I want to see the watch." Alejandro glanced toward the display and burst into laughter. Employees laughed nervously with him. "That watch?" Mateo nodded. Alejandro crouched slightly and smiled. But there was cruelty hidden beneath the smile. "Listen carefully." He pointed toward the display. "Este reloj no es para ti." Several people nearby smiled awkwardly. Alejandro stood up again. "Some things are meant for certain people." He adjusted his cufflinks. "And some aren't." Mateo looked at him silently. The room became strangely quiet. Alejandro expected disappointment. He expected embarrassment. He expected the boy to lower his head and leave. Instead Mateo simply asked. "Why?" Alejandro raised an eyebrow. "Because life works that way." Mateo looked at the watch again. Then at Alejandro. Then he asked softly. "Did someone tell you that when you were little?" The smile on Alejandro's face disappeared. For the first time, silence filled the room completely. Nobody expected the question. Not even Alejandro. And suddenly something strange happened. Because for one brief moment, the millionaire remembered something he had spent years trying to forget. A small boy. Standing in front of a store window. Looking at something he couldn't afford. Hearing someone say, "That's not for people like you." And for the first time that day, Alejandro Vargas stopped smiling. Alejandro Vargas stood frozen in the middle of the boutique. The rain outside continued falling softly against the windows, but inside, the silence had become heavier than stone. Mateo's question had struck something deep within him, something he had buried beneath years of success, luxury, and pride. For a few seconds, the millionaire wasn't standing in an expensive suit inside one of the city's most prestigious stores. It was somewhere else. Somewhere far away. It was 10 years old again. He remembered worn shoes. He remembered walking beside his mother through crowded streets. He remembered stopping in front of a store window and staring at a watch. Not because it was expensive, not because it was famous, but because his father had once owned a watch very similar to it before he passed away. He remembered thinking that one day, when he became successful, he would buy one exactly like it. But he also remembered entering that store with hope in his eyes and hearing a man laugh. That isn't for people like you. Those words had burned into him like fire. The memory disappeared. Alejandro blinked and returned to the present. Mateo was still standing there quietly. Watching him. Not with anger. Not with fear. Just watching him. Alejandro slowly straightened his jacket. He looked around and noticed that everyone was staring at him. The employees waited nervously for him to say something clever, something cold, something that would make everyone laugh again. Instead, he remained silent. For the first time in years, Alejandro felt uncomfortable. Not because of business. Not because of money. Because of a child. Mateo looked at the watch again. Then he looked at the salesperson. Can I still see it? The woman hesitated. She looked at Alejandro. Usually, his expression alone decided everything. But Alejandro didn't say anything. The old security guard near the entrance watched quietly. Finally the woman carefully opened the display and placed the watch on the counter. Mateo approached slowly. His eyes widened. He didn't touch it immediately. He looked at it as if it were something fragile. Something important. Alejandro crossed his arms. He couldn't understand it. Most people who entered these stores wanted to show off. They wanted status. Attention. Power. But this boy looked at the watch differently. Almost like he was looking at a memory. Alejandro finally spoke. Why that one? Mateo looked up. My father had one similar to this. Alejandro said nothing. Mateo continued. He worked fixing clocks and watches. The boy smiled slightly. He used to tell me something. Alejandro frowned it. What? Mateo looked at the watch. He said watches are strange. Alejandro waited. Mateo continued softly. They remind people that time keeps moving no matter how rich or poor someone is. Nobody spoke. Mateo lowered his eyes. My father passed away last year. The room suddenly felt different. Even the employees looked uncomfortable. Mateo held his envelope carefully. He always wanted his own little watch shop someday. Alejandro's face slowly changed. The arrogance that had covered him moments earlier was beginning to disappear. Mateo opened the paper envelope. Inside were small bills and coins. Very carefully folded. Very carefully saved. Alejandro stared. How much is that? Mateo counted slowly. I've been saving for 8 months. The employees exchanged looks. Alejandro looked at the money. Then at the price tag. The watch cost more than the boy could probably save in years. Mateo looked toward the salesperson. Is it enough? The woman looked down. She couldn't answer. Mateo already knew. He saw it in her face. Slowly he placed the money back into the envelope. Then he smiled. Not angrily. Not sadly. Just quietly. It's okay. Alejandro suddenly felt something tighten in his chest. Because years ago. That had been him. Smiling to hide disappointment. Pretending not to hurt. Mateo turned toward the exit. He began walking away. Then Alejandro spoke. Wait. The boy stopped. Alejandro looked at the salesperson. I'll buy it. The employee smiled immediately. Of course. That made sense. The millionaire saves the day. Perfect ending. But Mateo surprised everyone again. He shook his head. No. Alejandro blinked. No. Mateo looked directly into his eyes. I don't want you to buy it for me. Alejandro looked confused. Mateo continued. My father said gifts are beautiful. He smiled softly. But earning something feels different. Silence. Complete silence. Alejandro stared at him. This little boy wasn't asking for pity. Wasn't he asking for help? Wasn't he asking for money? And suddenly Alejandro realized something terrifying. The child standing in front of him had something he himself had lost years ago. Dignity. Alejandro slowly sat down in one of the chairs. For perhaps the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about meetings. Or profits. Or numbers. He was thinking about who he had become. After several moments he looked up. What was your father's dream? Mateo smiled. A watch shop. Alejandro looked at the old security guard. Then at the employees. Then back at Mateo. And something changed inside him. 3 months later, newspapers across the city carried an unusual story. Not about a company acquisition. Not about investments. Not about billionaire rankings. The headline read. Millionaire opens free training workshop for children and young watchmakers. People were shocked. Alejandro Vargas had invested millions creating workshops where children from struggling families could learn skills, repair watches, study business, and pursue dreams. Inside the first workshop, above the entrance, a small sentence was written on the wall. Some things are for everyone. On opening day, reporters surrounded Alejandro. When asked him, what inspired this project? Alejandro looked toward the crowd. Near the back stood Mateo. Wearing clean clothes. Smiling. On his wrist was the same watch from the boutique. Not gifted. Earned. Because Alejandro had later offered him small jobs helping organize the workshop and learning basic watch repair. Mateo had worked every afternoon. Saved every payment. And eventually bought it himself. Alejandro smiled. Then answered. A child reminded me of something important. The reporter asked. What exactly? Alejandro looked toward Mateo. Then he smiled. That money can buy almost anything. It boasts. But respect. His eyes grew softer. Respect has to be earned. Years later, people would remember Alejandro Vargas as a successful businessman. But many remembered something else. They remembered the day a little boy walked into a luxury store with a paper envelope in his hands. And gave a millionaire a lesson he never forgot.